I am Laura Stoner, and I am here with Charlie Trueheart, and we are going to talk about your family and experience during Vietnam and the ambassador relations you have. I'm here with Paige Newman and Danny Flake, and we're here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture on October 16th, 2023. And I'm going to start off by asking you what your full name is.
My full name is Charles Trueheart.
You do.
No middle name.
Did your parents do that on purpose?
Yes, my father felt that with a last name like ours, we didn't need a middle name. So my brother and I don't have middle names. And he actually hated his middle name, Clyde. So
You decided you just didn't need that. So where were you born?
I was born in Washington, D.C., September 5th, 1951.
And what were your parents' names?
My father was William Clyde Trueheart, and my mother was Phoebe Anna Everett Trueheart. And she was from Kentucky. She was from Maysville, Kentucky.
So how did they meet?
Well, my father, as you know, was born in Chester, Virginia, and they both went to work in Washington my father during the war, and my mother just after the war, I believe. My mother was a commercial artist, and she drew fashion advertising for department stores. And they met through mutual friends. I actually don't know who introduced them, but they were young. Many people came to Washington. The city swelled in those years, and they were two of those people.
And so they had you while they were
So
living.
they were married in 1948, and I was born in 1951. And in 1954, my father joined the Foreign Service. He had been working for the government in other agencies as a civil servant, and he joined the Foreign Service and was posted to Paris, France, and he was a political officer in the U.S. delegation to NATO, which was then in Paris. So he was not at the embassy, but at the kind of mini embassy at NATO. And his immediate superior there was Frederick Nolting, who would become my godfather in Paris, and who had been my father's close friend at Charlottesville from 1939 to 1942. He and Nolting were grad students in philosophy, and they intended to spend their lives teaching philosophy.
So they went to UVA together.
So they went to UVA together. My father went to UVA. My father was a good deal younger than Nolting, 7 years younger. But Nolting had to stop his studies during the Depression to help his father's business in Richmond. And so he had this basically lost, quote unquote, lost 7 years of his life. So he and my father were basically at the same point in their academic careers when they met in 1939.
And your dad had military service during World War II.
After Charlottesville, well, Pearl Harbor came in December 41, and almost immediately Fritz Nolting joined the Navy and was in the Navy for the next 4 years. And my father went to one of his professors suggested that he and some other bright guys trained to be cryptanalysts to read code, and that they did that and immediately were offered jobs and lateral entry into the Army. My father didn't particularly like cryptanalysis, but all the assessments of him said, this is what you're
Supposed to
this is what you're supposed to do. So he did all his work breaking Japanese code in the United States. He didn't serve during war. He didn't serve overseas.
And there's a connection between your father's family and Nolting's family that happened before they even met.
Before they were born. Shall I tell that story?
Yeah, sure.
Well, I learned this in the course of researching my book, Diplomats at War. Just a reference my father made in an oral history. The interviewer asked him, before you went to Saigon, had you known Nolting long? Or had you known Nolting? And he said, it was kind of a leading question because I'm sure the interviewer knew the whole story. But he said, yes, in fact, Fritz's father got my father into business. And the story is that my grandfather, also William Trueheart, was a telegrapher on the Eastern Seaboard Railroad. I don't really know much about that, but apparently the stations along the line communicated with each other through the telegraph, and he did that. And he was an ambitious guy, and in 1905, he applied to be a banker, and the person who interviewed him was Fritz's future father. So none of the children were born then. And he got in, so he went to work for him, and by the next year, my grandfather had persuaded them to open a bank in Chester, which apparently didn't have a bank. And so he became the president and the teller and the janitor of this tiny bank in Chester, presumably with money invested by Nolting and Nolting Sr. and his partner. I don't know much more about that except that my grandfather worked at that bank for the next 40, 50 years and never left Chester or anything like that. So that was a connection that I never knew about it. Presumably Bill and Fritz discovered this and knew about it. For all I know, they may have crossed paths between they were born in 1911 and 1918 respectively, but did they cross paths before Charlottesville? I honestly don't know, and I wish I did. But it was an interesting connection between them, given all that happened.
It's a small and big world all at the same time. So your dad goes into the Foreign Service through his military.
Well, he was a civil servant. He worked in intelligence in the post-war period, and had civil service jobs where he was basically briefing. He did do some travel during those years. He went to the Paris Peace Conference in 1946, and the kind of work he did was to learn the latest intelligence that had come in to the United States government, and then to brief higher-ups. So he kind of knew, he had to master a lot of different foreign policy things, but also be able to present them to sometimes very important ranking senior people. Has any of you seen Oppenheimer? Well, you know, one of the major characters is Louis Strauss. And I was able to do a Freedom of Information Act request for my father's government records, which were about about 7 or 8 inches thick, essentially of no interest, sadly, except there are all these performance reviews of him. And then the main question was, do you think he's a communist? Just because they asked that of everyone. And one of the people he briefed from time to time was Louis Strauss. And Louis Strauss said, the only interesting thing I found in that huge pile of paper, which was, they asked, any shortcomings? Did my father have any shortcomings? And Strauss wrote, none other than shyness, which is very true. He was a kind of a shy guy, but he was also somebody who spoke his mind very bluntly. But when he was 28 or 30 years old, I can easily imagine him a very respectful, shy person.
Mm-hmm.
So I went back in, the last footnote I put in my book was to footnote Louis Strauss and say, played by Robert Downey Jr. in
Oppenheimer.
2023.
So you were born in DC.
So I moved to Paris. We moved to Paris. I was an only child at that time in 1954, and we lived in Paris for 4 years. I was put in French school. I'm not exactly sure why, but it turned out to be a very useful thing to have done, for me to have done. Then my father was I'll go into more detail if you want, but my father was posted to Ankara, Turkey for what turned out to be just 1 year in 1958, and then to London, where we lived from 1959 to 1961. And in London, I had gone to an American Air Force school in Ankara, Turkey. But in London, I was put back in French school because my parents, the English schools that they considered the kids all wore uniforms. And my parents objected to that. And so they put me in the French school because that was considered the kind of looser, more informal education. And I have to say, having put my own kids through French school in France, there's nothing loose about it. And it's a very, kind of famously old-fashioned, the opposite of warm and fuzzy schooling.
Uh-huh.
In any case, then in 1961, not long before I turned 10, my father got his next assignment in Saigon.
Thanks. You have a quick question.
No, I just wanted to bring us up to that point, and we can go back if you want, sure.
Did your mom enjoy being in Paris? I assume being a fashion illustrator, that would be a place where you might find a lot of inspiration.
She did. I think she loved the life. You have to remember that in those days, Foreign Service wives, and they were 98% of the spouses were women, were expected to work hard as the adjunct to their husbands. And in fact, in the performance reviews that were done annually, and I knew about them after a certain age that they were coming up, or that my father had gotten a good one or whatever. There's a whole section on how the spouse measures up and whether she's an asset to the officer and his work. And I actually think there were probably a number of FSOs, Foreign Service officers, whose wives became a problem for them professionally because they weren't playing the game. But my mother was I think loved that life. She didn't particularly like Turkey, but she loved living in Europe. And then beginning in Saigon, she loved being the wife of an important person in the embassy.
Did you, at what point did you become fluent in French, and did your family speak French with you, or?
Immediately, because I started going to kindergarten. I don't know, I must have been 4. It was probably 4, and it was all in French. And for a while, anecdotally, I spoke much better French than English. And so my parents were learning French and they did learn to speak French, but they had this sort of quasi-French kid for a while.
But it was probably very helpful once they went to Saigon.
Well, it was certainly that one of the, again, I don't think hardly anyone except old people speaks French in Vietnam today, but French was the lingua franca. French was the language of the government, even though there was and is a very healthy Vietnamese spoken and written language. French was, it's also the language of diplomacy in a lot of places. So the fact that Bill Trueheart and Fritz Nolting were chosen to go to Saigon was probably on the basis of the fact that they spoke French. The other interesting historical point about their selection and the selection of a lot of American diplomats who served in Asia is that during the 1950s, during the McCarthy period, a number of the most senior and best known American diplomats who knew China and knew Asia, and there were quite a few because there'd been a huge missionary tradition, American missionaries serving in China and Japan and elsewhere. Many of them were purged from the Foreign Service, and also the message went out that, if you express any interest in anything to do with Asia, you might be suspect. In any case, so the people who were left to go and serve, I'm obviously oversimplifying, but the people who were left to go and serve were French speakers. And Fritz and Bill, Fritz Nolting had remained in Paris throughout. He had come to Paris a year after we did and had stayed on until 61. So he was there 6 years, which is a long time in post for any Foreign Service officer.
Mm-hmm. And your families were very interconnected.
Well, we were very close. So we had been close in what the couples had been close. The Noltings had their 4 girls before my parents had any children. So they're older. Well, Fritz was older. Biddy, his wife, is about my parents' generation, and she's still alive. Still living in Charlottesville, age 102.
Wow.
And she's from Danville, Virginia. So the Truehearts and the Noltings knew each other in Washington. As I recount in the book, the Noltings had a farm in Fairfax County that they bought. And my parents lived in the city. And then there they were posted together, working together in Paris. And then we went off to Turkey and London and rejoined the Noltings in 61 when Fritz was named ambassador to Vietnam. And when I say Vietnam in this context, I'm referring to South Vietnam, because North Vietnam, we didn't have a representation in North Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 2 countries,
At that time, yes.
supposedly with a temporary line in between them.
And so prior to getting to Saigon, how did you feel about your upbringing? I got a sense from the book that you missed
a le-
being American.
leading question. Yeah, I had sort of expected, and maybe my parents had expected that they might, having been away from Washington for 7 years, that they might return. It's normal for the rotation in the Foreign Service then and now. And some of that may have rubbed off on me because I was going to French school with English boys, and it's maybe hard for you all to imagine, but in those days, it's very hard to know what was going on back in the States, except just glimpses through movies, and there was hardly any TV. And I was worried about not fitting in as an American, not being an American. And, I wore short pants every day, and I could tell from pictures I'd seen that no little boys my age wore short pants. They all wore blue jeans. And so, yeah, so I didn't want to be, my father at least wrote his mother that I didn't want to be associated with with speaking French or being a European. But I was adjusting to that, when you're 9, 10, 11 years old, you start to see the world in a new way, begin to imagine yourself as an adult soon, all those adolescent sensations. And to that, I had to add needing to be acculturated.
So you,
But I mean, I think to answer your question more fully, I felt very fortunate, and I understood that I was fortunate and really lucky and rare to be growing up overseas. It seemed exotic even then, and I could tell when I went back to the States and saw my cousins. I mean, the ones my age thought I was odd, but the parents were obviously very interested in how my parents were handling, you put your kid in French school, that's weird.
but I'm not, if you're talking to Kentucky cousins, that would be very, very different for them.
Yeah, I guess that's true. All my cousins were in Kentucky because my father had, I had no cousins on my Virginia side.
But your parents had another child.
My brother was born in London in 1960, so I got a baby brother almost 9 years in.
But to move from London to Saigon and adjust to being a family of 4, that.
With an infant. Yeah, well, in London, in those days, Europe was very inexpensive compared to the United States, and one's money went a long way. But my brother had an English nanny who was on the scene before he was even born. She was getting ready, and in Saigon, we went to a place and a position, a house that had 9 servants, which was another whole. I'd never experienced anything like that, and one of them was my brother's nanny. So, I mean, yes, it was an adventure for my parents, but they had a lot of help my father had a chauffeur to take him to work, and there were people running around the house and cooking and doing everything. So to free her up, because she was a very active entertainer, and it was expected that you would have house guests from Washington at a moment's notice, and also that you could put on cocktail parties for 200 people just, the following week if you needed to. And there were always people to help, not just servants, but other wives of other people in the embassy all got together to help circulate and draw up a guest list. I can remember spending a lot of time as a family at cocktail hour looking over guest lists for parties that they were either going to or throwing. It was a very social, very, very social scene in Saigon. And I kind of got into it. I mean, as you read, I sort of enjoyed the whole thing and tried to help out and filled the cigarette boxes, emptied the ashtrays, things like that, and looked at these guest lists, which were always arranged in order of protocol. You know, the most important people, the sections of people. Here's the Americans, here's the Vietnamese, here's the diplomatic community. It was cool.
Yeah. So when you arrived in Saigon, how did you feel? I mean, it must have been so different than London, because London wasn't two countries that were fighting a war.
That, and also in London, in London and in Paris, we basically blended in, except for the way we dressed. You might not know we were not French or British, as the case may be. In Saigon, it was obviously we didn't look like everybody, and so it was presumed that we were, well, either diplomatic personnel or there were American business people living there. There were 800 kids in the school, American community school, K through 12. So that's a lot of American families. My parents first put me in French school in Saigon, thinking, well, that's what we're due, you know, and I hated it. I think I just said, I don't want to do this. And as everywhere, I came in the middle of the year. Today in the Foreign Service, they don't move families except in the summertime just to avoid this. But in those days, they just say, you're leaving, you need to show up at this next place. So I went to the American school and was very happy there. It was not a particularly good school. But and for that reason, I did very well, and made friends, and began to feel my Americanness.
Did you? How did the relationship between Nolting and your dad? Did it change at all when he became the ambassador, and your dad, his second in command?
Thank you. Well, I honestly wouldn't know. Nolting was senior to my father and had been his boss in Paris, and they worked very closely together. And I don't know, it never occurred to me to wonder. They were very close. And I don't really think that changed in Saigon. I think they had the reason that Nolting chose my father to be his number two was because he trusted him. And he knew what he was getting, or he thought he did. But Nolting was a very informal guy, and I never got the impression either then or since in anything I read that this went to his head. He was not a vain, he had many faults, but he was not a vain person, egotistical person. He was a very warm, trusting, almost to a fault, trusting person, and an optimistic person. And from everything I could tell, and maybe even from everything they could tell, they got along very well in Saigon and were complementary personalities and were focused on these big problems that they were facing as diplomats. And the main one was doing everything they could to make the government of Vietnam more effective at reaching the people and more effective at resisting subversion and terrorism of the Viet Cong, and working with the Vietnamese to make the Vietnamese do it rather than the United States doing it for them. And of course, that became one of the big dilemmas of the whole, well, the pacification effort of those days, but also of the war itself. The Vietnamese didn't like the fact that the U.S. was telling them what to do or fighting the war for them, but they were not able to do it for themselves. So they were, it was an extremely difficult position for them and for us. So that was the challenge that Bill and Fritz and this huge embassy growing by leaps and bounds every day with new infusions of money and personnel. And then beginning, especially in 1962, many more U.S. military personnel living in Saigon. And they brought with them all the things that go with big military presence anywhere, you know, a bowling alley, bigger commissary, everything to kind of be the support system of the military, who, except for the ranking officers, didn't come with their wives. So the situation, the U.S. presence was growing visibly, even for me to notice in the 2.5 years we were there. And it was not until the events of 1963 that, well, maybe a little bit before then, that there became evident differences between Bill and Fritz about about the best way to proceed.
So in the beginning, they were doing rural pacification.
That was one of the big hopes, that pacification was a kind of had a lot of utility. Pacification was kind of a euphemism, because what they wanted to do was to create zones in the Vietnamese countryside that were self-sufficient and could defend themselves against Viet Cong, who tended to operate at night. And the Viet Cong, as you can well imagine, knowing what we know about other parts of the world today, the friendly farmer during the day, his son or his brother might be a Viet Cong soldier at night. And so it was very, the distinctions between ordinary Vietnamese, especially in rural Vietnamese, was difficult to draw that line. So pacification was about making agricultural improvements, but also building things called strategic hamlets, which was a British colonial concept, but also one that had been used for centuries in different societies, but basically to create villages that could defend themselves against predators. And the theory was that once you had enough of these villages, these hamlets, they would all begin to, the ink blot theory, they would all begin to grow together, and in the process we wouldn't have any more
To push out.
any more Viet Cong. And even for the first year that Nolting and Trueheart were there, it seemed to be working to some extent. It was all being done by the Vietnamese, but the Vietnamese was being run by the brother of the president of Vietnam, whose name was Ngo Dinh Nhu. The president was named Ngo Dinh Diem, spelled D-I-E-M, but pronounced Diem. And his brother was Ngo Dinh Nhu, and he was the kind of evil guy behind the scenes, the house intellectual, the kind of Rasputin figure. And Ngo Dinh Nhu was in charge of the strategic hamlets. And at the embassy, my father was in charge of the strategic hamlets. So they worked closely together to coordinate all that.
He ran
And
did they
well,
call it the country?
he was the principal U.S. liaison with the Strategic Hamlet Program. And because they met every day about this was like an ongoing, this was like a military effort. And on some respects, it was a military effort. Anyway, there was some evidence in 1962, the second year that Fritz and Bill were there, that the Hamlet program was working and that the Viet Cong had been surprised by the effectiveness of it. And later it turned out that the North Vietnamese, who were backing the Viet Cong, of course, had seen 1962 as a bad year for themselves. They had lost ground, and nonetheless, in Washington especially, pessimism about the progress being made on all these fronts was growing, probably even more than it was growing at the embassy in Saigon. But certainly in Saigon, the more junior officers, the one at the embassy and the soldiers who were in the field could tell, because they had contacts with reality out in the field, and they could tell things were not going well. And so there began to be a big and on top of all that, a new crop of American reporters were in Vietnam reporting how things were going and not going well, in ways that enraged Fritz Nolting, because he thought they were being inaccurate and selective. And it enraged people in Washington, including President Kennedy. Let me soothe my throat. So I think in 1962 and the first part of 1963 was a period when skepticism about the viability of the Diem regime and the effectiveness of the struggle with the Viet Cong began to take hold in the official mindset. And there's evidence that's in my book that that Bill was openly associated with voicing some of this skepticism and some of this impatience with the Vietnamese government. And the only instances I was able to uncover, Nolting finds it useful to have someone else who will speak that while he can speak the more positive line. And all the reporting that all the officers were doing, Foreign Service officers were doing in Saigon, goes to Washington in 1963 in the form of telegrams, and the ambassador, or in his absence, the number two, signs all the telegrams. And Nolting was actually very honest about if a telegram came up from somebody who was reporting bad news, I think, he might put a cover note on it and say, I think this is overstated, or I'm hearing other things that make this not as serious as it may sound. But I think Nolting was an honest broker about that. And up until the bitter end, which we'll come to, was astonished to hear that there was any division of opinion in his own embassy. So that's what I mean about his very trusting personality and his sunny outlook on the world. And that was an outlook that my father just didn't share. I mean, he was not that sort of person. He was a more cynical person and a more hard-headed and skeptical person, I think. So that takes us into 1963, where some significant things begin to happen to turn the tide.
And there's an increasing presence of American military along the way.
Increasing presence of American military. When we arrived in fall of 61, I believe there were 800 or 900 military personnel in Saigon.
Advising.
Doing one thing or another, but not fighting, no. And by the end of 1963, so 2 years later, there were 16,000. Now, when you think about the fact that 4 years later there would be 500,000 Americans in Vietnam, these seem like very small numbers, but they were big and they were noticed back home, especially as Americans started to die. Even advisors could be killed in helicopter crashes or roadside bombs. Viet Cong was attacking places all over, and the more Americans and the more visible Americans were, the more they were attacked. And so it began to attract the attention of members of Congress. There were congressional visits to Saigon all the time. My parents had to entertain them. They were present. They stayed with us sometimes. My parents had given me an autograph book in London for a birthday present, and so I was constantly collecting signatures of now forgotten senators, congressmen, and many other people, including Ngo Dinh Diem. But my father took it in his pocket and had him sign at the end of one of their meetings. So the American presence was growing and becoming more controversial. And
you said in your book that you had free reign of the city, that your parents let you ride your bike anywhere you wanted to ride it. And Saigon is fairly safe because it's, the center of the Southern Vietnamese government. But are you perceiving a difference in the way you live your life?
You mean back then?
61 to 63?
No. Well, if anything, yes, it was safe. But from where I sit today, as a parent, or a former parent, I should say, it's amazing to me that they let me loose in this city, because there were Viet Cong all over the place. And in 1960, I think it was the first one, 1963, it was 63, there was an American movie theater, one of the things that had popped up because of the big presence of Americans. And some Viet Cong came into to a movie in progress and set off a bomb and killed one or two people, those adults, and not, but because the kids was mainly kids in the theaters, including me. I was actually late for the movie and missed the bomb. But you'd think that might have changed the rules,
Sobered them a little.
but I didn't, I didn't go far. I went to see friends who lived nearby, uh, a few blocks away, and there was a place, a kind of, well, in the States, it would be the country club or the city pool or something, where we gathered almost every day, called the Cercle Sportif, which was, they had tennis courts, and I took judo lessons there, and they had, there was a whole colonial setup. It was a beautiful, beautiful city in those days, and so there was plenty for us to do. I was in the U.S. Boy Scout Troop Number 1, Saigon, and bat boy for the high school baseball team. There was a kind of little America deal. But to get from one place to another, we had to ride our bikes, or I don't know if you've seen pictures or been to Vietnam, but there's something called cyclopousse, which are two varieties. One is a bicycle with two bicycle wheels in front and a seat in the middle. And then there's a motorcycle version. And I had permission to take the bicycle ones, which cost about 5 cents to go anywhere I wanted to go. But of course, being a 10 or 11-year-old, we started taking the motorcycle ones. And these are things that, if you're going to hit something, you're going to hit first. So I think I lived a little more dangerously than my parents fully realized, but I have no recollection of them ever being concerned or ever saying, let's say my dad got a report that the Viet Cong were planning something in the city. I just don't remember any, like, you better stay home today or come straight home. Because we had buses the school bus had grenade mesh on the windows, and there was a U.S. Marine on the bus to take us back and forth to school. So somebody thought there was a security problem, but apparently not the parents of me and all my friends.
And you said that Nolting had a grenade thrown in his car.
Before we even got there, he on the way back to work, all the diplomats went home for lunch in their chauffeur-driven cars and then went back after a little nap. It's kind of almost like a Spanish schedule. And he had a grenade thrown in his car, and he got out of the car and threw it off, and it didn't go off. But it was pretty terrifying. Anyway, until some of the events of 1963, there were certainly no restrictions. And also, as I was getting older, I was demanding more freedom and or trying to push the envelope.
Mm-hmm. So then, 1963, it's changing. The people aren't having good reports about what's going on in the country side.
Mm-hmm.
And there's more frustration with the Diem regime, and there's like some religious issues going on. So can you talk more about?
Sure. I mean, it's really in 1963 that things begin to get a lot of attention worldwide. The first one happens in the very first days of January 63, and that's a battle in a town called Ap Bac. A battle between Vietnamese Army forces and Viet Cong outpost. And the the South Vietnamese Army are ferried into the battle scene by, of course, by American helicopters. And it's a rout, and the South Vietnamese are, helicopters are downed and crashed. The Viet Cong get away without any casualties. It's a small battle compared to battles that you might know about from World War II or whatever, but because it was such a humiliating defeat, and because some of the soldiers started leaking to some of these reporters about how bad it had been and what terrible fighters the South Vietnamese were. South Vietnamese officers had a dilemma, which is that Diem, who followed everything very closely and knew everybody, hated casualties. And so the response, perhaps the natural response, was not to engage. I'm just going to get in trouble if I fight harder. And so that was the kind of mentality that was exposed by APAC. So that really began to shake the confidence of President Kennedy and others in Washington in the viability of the war effort. The next big thing that happens is that in May of '63, something happens that nobody was expecting, and that an issue in Vietnam that had never been mentioned and may not have really existed except, well, it certainly existed latently. And that is that the Buddhists, a little context, the Diem family, Diem and his family, who held a lot of important posts, were Roman Catholics. One of the reasons that the U.S. got behind Diem in the first place in the 1950s was that he was a Roman Catholic. He was an anti-communist, and he was a Catholic, and that was more relatable to Americans. And a lot of influential Americans, not just Catholics, were behind him. But Catholics were only about 10% of the Vietnamese population, which was, while not overwhelmingly Buddhist, mainly Buddhist.
And the Catholicism had links to the French colonial.
And of course, that's why the French had installed all the kind of ruling classes of Vietnam, and the government officials and the business people were French educated, either in Vietnam or in France. And, you know, it's like the French language reminded everyone of the colonial power, and French and the French religion of the colonial power. So this was a colonizer's religion, and all the most important, many of the most important people in the Vietnamese hierarchy were Catholic, but the vast majority of people, of course, were not. And so in May, there was a big Buddhist celebration, birthday of Buddha, and through a series of events that are too complicated to go into here, there was a big demonstration, anti-government demonstration of Buddhists, and the Vietnamese police, the Vietnamese authorities came in and mowed down a bunch of people. 7 or 8 people died. And all hell broke loose. It was an American APC that had done the mowing down. The government, the Vietnamese government, said that it was actually the Viet Cong, who were behind the Buddhists and who had put on monks' robes to try to fool people, and other observers, American and otherwise, saw this as this latent opposition to the government that was using the Vietnamese protest as a kind of a cat's paw. And so a big difference of opinion about the meaning of all this, but it had clearly struck a nerve, and the Vietnamese, the Buddhists began to have demands that the Diem regime didn't wish to grant, about their autonomy, releasing of prisoners, and all kinds of things, kind of a laundry list of demands that put pressure on the Vietnamese government to carry out some of the reforms that the U.S., among many others, had been urging on the government privately for many years, long before Nolting. As that kettle is beginning to boil, and this is crucial to my story, Nolting, who's been in Vietnam for 2 years without a vacation, goes on vacation with his family. The 2 daughters who were going to school in Saigon and 2 who were in college in the U.S. And
like Nolting had like a very close relationship with Diem, right?
he did, and he thought that the Buddhist events in Hue, where they took place, the city of Hue, would blow over, and that the government was managing the problem well enough for him to go on vacation. And so he went on vacation at the end of May for what turned out to be 6 weeks, and leaving my father in charge as acting ambassador, or chargé d'affaires, as they say in French, even for an American. And a few days after Nolting leaves, the first of the very famous, notorious self-immolations of Buddhist monks happens on a street corner 3 blocks from my house. An aging monk gets out of the car. Another monk pours gasoline on him and sets him afire in a staged demonstration. And this was incredibly shocking to everyone, obviously everyone in Saigon and around the world. And it shocked President Kennedy, and it seemed to symbolize, even though it comes out of nowhere in a sense, this Buddhist protest, it seemed to crystallize the problem that Diem and his government had, that he didn't have the support of the people, and the majority of the population was against him. And how could we expect him to be an effective leader, and how could we expect him, even more importantly, to fight this communist menace? So at that point, the language being directed in Washington towards Diem becomes much tougher than it ever had been for the last 2 years. The messages that Fritz Nolting was delivering, because he believed in Diem, were seemingly always couched in encouragement and perhaps softened as a result. But now it was my father, it Bill Trueheart who had to deliver these messages. And I believe they were messages he felt he didn't just have to deliver them, he actually believed that they were necessary to try to shake up Ziem. And so he has to go almost daily to protest something or another that that Ziem or knew was doing or not doing to try to meet the demands of the Buddhists, to try to restore order, to try to show the kind of leadership that the U.S. believed he should be showing. And these threats did not sit well with Ziem, and he felt very much on the defensive, openly missed the presence of Fritz Nolting, tried to send messages for Nolting to come back, because only Nolting understood him. And meanwhile, my father became the devil incarnate from the point of view of the Vietnamese government. Now, pouring not literal gasoline, but figurative gasoline on all of this was a third major Vietnamese character who you can read about in my book, who was, there was Diem, Brother New, always called by the Americans Brother New, and New's wife, Madame New, who, because the president was a bachelor, she played the role of the First Lady of South Vietnam and was the official hostess at the presidential palace and had her own women's paramilitary force and was an incredibly outspoken and very reactionary person. She was behind all the blue laws forbidding dancing, cockfighting, underwire bras. She was a kind of lunatic, but very photogenic, much younger. She was probably about 30 when all this was going on. And she had a lot of power, and she didn't mind speaking her mind. And of course, American reporters ate it up. And she especially hated Bill Trueheart, and thought that he was, kind of a loose cannon and was merely repeating what the American reporters were telling him to say and all kinds of things. So this was all coming to a boil. Meanwhile, Fritz Nolting and his family are sailing the Aegean, blissfully unaware of the self-immolation of the monk, and the fact that the shit had hit the fan in his own embassy in a way, but in his own capital.
Can we stop for a second?
Yeah.
I remember in the book you said that you actually went to go visit the site of the first self-immolation
After
the event.
after the fact.
Yeah.
And we believe we saw my pals and I think there were still like flowers around, and there was a kind of a burnt patch on the street, so we could see where that had happened. And there are lots of other ways to be aware of it. I believe it was that my father had to close the school because there was worry that there might be other incidents like this. But we were. I mean, it was shocking and morbidly fascinating to us as well. Yeah.
Okay, so Nolting has no idea.
So Nolting is I mean, it's a little hard to believe today that something as dramatic and especially as important to him in his work as this would not have gotten his attention, and that he would not have been informed about this, and not have been informed that the president of Vietnam wanted him to go back. And from what I can piece together, and I'm pretty sure of this, the one person who wasn't telling him what was going on was Bill, his old friend. And I think it's pretty clear that either Bill didn't think it was his place, or he'd been told specifically not to tell Nolting.
From like the
Because,
White House?
because the people who were running Vietnam from the State Department and the White House really didn't want Nolting there, because Nolting hadn't been doing the job that they wanted him to do, which was to really bring down the hammer on this guy.
But-
So
So in that time period, I'm just trying to think about
Yeah.
it, like he would have had, you could have sent him a telegram, maybe somewhere, if you knew where he was going to be, you could have
well,
sent.
he's on a boat. He's on a private yacht.
Oh, so they probably don't have.
Now, in 1963, you'd think there's a ship's radio, but I think the real surprise is that they were obviously putting him to port from place to place. And Nolting remembers in one of his oral histories seeing a headline in maybe the Herald Tribune, if he could read it, or just seeing a picture in a Greek newspaper during the cruise. But he always says, I counted on Bill or his bosses in Washington to get in touch with him if they thought he was needed. So it was a kind of passive response to me. I think on some level he didn't want to go back.
2 years without a vacation, and
Yeah, and I think anyway, it's psychologically kind of complicated what he must have been going through. But in any case, he finishes this Aegean cruise, and then so they're on land. They can read the Herald Tribune, which, as you all know, was the late lamented English language newspaper. He could have read that. He also stayed in Athens at the home of the CIA station chief, who was a friend, who was certainly clued into what was going on. He could have gotten in touch with Washington from Athens or overland to Italy, where they were going to get on another boat. So he had several days during the middle part of June to inform himself or say, I think I should go back or whatever. He didn't do that. He would say, no one told me. I thought for sure they would tell me if they thought I was needed. Anyway, so they go and they board a big ocean liner, the Constitution, USS Constitution in Genoa or Naples, and sail to New York. So that's about a 6-day, 7-day trip in those days. Again, cut off from communications. But one thing they learn on the ship going to New York is that Nolting's been fired and that a new ambassador has been named. A very famous, in the day, guy named Henry Cabot Lodge, who had been the vice presidential candidate of the Republican ticket under Nixon in 1960, and who was a former ambassador of the United Nations, former U.S. senator, grandson of a famous Secretary of State, big Boston Brahmin guy, is the new ambassador. And Nolting is obviously humiliated by this sacking, even though, as this book will tell you, 6 months earlier, he had told the Secretary of State that he wanted out and had always said, I only want to be there 2 years. And he was pushing to be relieved of his job and trying to push people in Washington name a new ambassador so that he could work with the, setting up the transition and so forth. So he was both shocked and humiliated, but also supposedly this is what he wanted. But he didn't like the way it happened. And he also was furious at his old friend. And Nolting manages to get the State Department to agree to send him back to Saigon for about a month to say his goodbyes and to see if he can work his magic with Diem. And so he comes back to Saigon. He and my father have it out, although I don't have any details about what was said, sadly. And they, of course, they continue to, he does say later that he should have fired him immediately. He wishes he had. But anyway, they somehow put on a happy face and work together again for another month while Nolting tries and fails to make headway with Diem. And Diem in the end makes all these assurances that reconciliation is his priority and that I love the Buddhists, etc.
But yours, the sister, the wife of New,
Madame New, yes.
she's
continuing to stir the pot all summer, giving interviews to both unfriendly and friendly American news media, and condemning the United States. After all, condemning the country that is sending, $1 million a day worth of economic aid and military material to her brother-in-law's government. And people are exasperated with her, and because whenever they think they've got some deal, she's stirring it up, and everybody in Washington is wondering why Diem can't make her shut up. And there's a lot of wonderful sexist stuff that is kind of redolent of the age. Anyway.
So Nolting and Bill.
So Nolting and Bill have it out, but anyway, there they are together working, this close every day. And it was not my father. Nolting didn't blame just my father. He blamed these other people who I haven't named, but obviously who are all named, and their various moves are described in the book. He realizes he's got a big job to do to turn around not just Diem, but also to turn around perceptions in Washington. And so anyway, he fails, he leaves. And a few days later, just after he leaves, and just after Diem promised that things were going to get better with the Buddhists, Brother New sends in his special military forces to the pagodas in Saigon, and they scale the walls, and there's beatings and shootings, and they're cracking down on the Buddhist pagodas, who they think are harboring communists. And then it's basically kind of a front for anti-Diem and anti-government activities. So basically violating all the promises that were made to Nolting. And so martial law is declared in Saigon, and that means that there's a curfew and nobody can be on the street after 10 o'clock or 8 o'clock or something. American school does stop for that. And into the middle of that, Henry Cabot Lodge arrives. And almost immediately, he's a very strong character. My father admired him a lot. He befriends the American correspondents. He gives asylum to some prominent Buddhist monks who had escaped from the pagoda raids in the embassy. And so he's clearly on the new program. He's clearly a guy who is not going to take any shit from Ziem or New, and he's going to lay down the line as he perceives is his job. Just as Nolting perceived that his job was to support the regime, it's pretty clear, Lodge, having talked to Kennedy, and you can listen to the two of them talking because the White House tapes were rolling, and I was able to hear Lodge get his instructions. At about the same time in Washington, while all the key players are off for the weekend, a telegram goes out to Lodge, essentially saying, this will not stand, and you should give the green light to the Vietnamese generals who want to overthrow the government. And because unless Ziem will get rid of New and Madame New, make them leave the country, something that was never going to happen, and that they've been trying to get him to do for years. We don't see how this government can be saved. So those are the new instructions, and there's a false start on a coup, but basically for the next 2 months, September and October, the U.S. is sitting around waiting for the generals to get their act together and pull off a coup. And they want it to be a coup that the U.S. has no fingerprints on this. We're letting nature take its course. That's what the U.S. wants. That's what Kennedy wants. He does not want to be implicated in the overthrow of the government, even though his people are helping the generals focus and and probably much more than that. Maybe some money too.
And your dad's still there.
My dad's still there. He's working for a new ambassador who and they feel they're really on the same wavelength about this. It's not like my father has any weight on what's going on, but Lodge trusts him, and Lodge also found when he got there that there were plenty of other people in the embassy who saw things the same way, and that in a lot of ways it may have been that Nolting was the one who was out of touch with what his embassy believed was the right course. Not everybody, and I've talked to a lot of people and read every oral history interview of even junior people who were there at the time. And so I'm now in 7th grade. We think we're going to be leaving in the spring. And certainly my parents knew that a coup was coming, and the book is full of really fascinating stories about Vietnamese friends of my parents who were terribly afraid that the coup was going to come, and since they were associated with the government, that they would be in danger, and wanting help, wanting asylum, wanting help to get out of the country, things like that. But I'm just sailing merrily along, being a 7th grader. So the coup finally happens on November 1st. Lodge is there, but not but stays home. And my father and the rest of the embassy is down at the embassy while the coup takes place. The one thing my father does on November 1st at lunchtime, I don't know how this worked, but I went to school, I guess, from about 7 in the morning until 12:30 or something like that. No school in the afternoon, ever. So I went to a friend's house for lunch, and my father called, knew where I was, and called to say, just keep Charlie there. There's a coup underway. And so for once, a little concern about where, but that suited me just fine, because who wouldn't want to be with a pal while something like that was going on? And so all night, we could hear guns and rockets going off, and it was a relatively bloodless coup. There was not a lot of violence. The U.S. was prepared, had sent Navy ships to the coast of Vietnam to extract American families if need be. If things had gone crazy and there was fighting for days and days, we might have been extracted. But it was all over in 24 hours, and maybe 100 people on both sides died, innocent victims and so on. But the two people who died most dramatically were Diem and his brother, who thought they were, who escaped the palace, tried to outsmart the coup plotters as they had done before years ago. But eventually, it was clear that the generals who had led the coup were in power and in place, and people were celebrating in the streets. So Diem and New believe they're going to surrender and get a plane out of the country, and agree to be picked up, to be met at a church, and agree to be picked up by people from the generals group. They are picked up and put in an APC and murdered in the back of the truck on the way to what they thought was exile. And the pictures get out, and the world is shocked yet again. Kennedy was apparently very surprised, because of course this is not what he wanted. They're fellow Catholics. And of course, he's got to know that his fingerprints are on this. It would be impossible for them not to be. It's true the Vietnamese generals pulled this off on their own, with their own plan, but they would not have moved ahead if they hadn't been assured. There was a CIA guy, very colorful character, who was kind of embedded with the coup plotters. So he was able to report everything they were saying and doing, including details about the assassination of Diem while it was going on, and who brought a bag full of money with him in case it was needed. Lots of money. I think it was $80,000, but that was a lot of money in those days, that he happened to just have in his closet. Anyway, so suddenly there's a new government. Everybody's relieved and happy, except members of the Diem and New families. It happens that Madame New is on an extended visit to the United States while all this happens. So she's front and center in the coverage of the coup. She's very worried about her children left behind in Vietnam. They are safely extracted, in part with help from my father under Lord's Lodge's direction. And so a new leaf has been turned in Vietnam, everybody in Washington thinks. And 3 weeks later, John F. Kennedy is assassinated. And suddenly there's a new president, and Lyndon Johnson had been in the minority of voices who was against a coup. But now he's left holding the bag, and the bag he's holding is that not only do we have the same problems as before, we may not have a Buddhist problem, but we still have a Viet Cong problem. And now we've got these untested and, as it turned out, short-lived generals as our ally. And there was another coup. Another group of generals overthrew the first group of generals in January, 2 months later. And there was another coup 6 months later. There were several governments, all, pro-American military type governments, but clearly it was pretty chaotic, and a chaotic time to try to become the political leader of an independent country facing a communist threat. The whole game had changed. This was now clearly a client state. And the coup d'etat had, in a sense, as I put it in the book, it's like when you go into Pottery Barn, if you break it, you own it. So they had broken this thing that they found, and now they owned it. And in a sense, Lyndon Johnson never escaped from having to prosecute this war. He could not. He was about to face election in 1964, so he couldn't do any withdrawal then. And it became the same thing for the rest of his presidency. It drove him from the presidency, and it took Nixon 4 years to find a kind of face-saving way, not terribly, but somewhat face-saving way to withdraw with peace talks, and but only delaying the inevitable, which was that, left to their own devices, the Vietnamese wanted Ho Chi Minh and the true nationalist, you might say, to prevail, and which finally happened in 1975. But the U.S. presence lasted from until 1973, and that was all that mattered to American public opinion. And no one was under any illusions that the Vietnamese, left to themselves, could stop this from happening. So the Trueheart family left in January of '64 with Johnson in the White House. Suddenly they wanted to ramp up everything even more in Vietnam, and bizarrely, Henry Cabot Lodge in March of 1964 from Saigon won the New Hampshire primary in a write-in vote. So Johnson's most prominent opponent for the presidency was his own ambassador in Saigon. Lodge finally left in June, so after only 9 months, to pursue that, which didn't happen. He did become the nominee. And there was many changings of the guard in Saigon during that period. But we came home in January of '64, and my father worked at the State Department in Washington for the next 5 years, and eventually became an ambassador himself. He became ambassador to Nigeria in 1969 and was there during the during the end of the Biafra War, if you remember that, there was a secessionist struggle in Nigeria, uh, which failed, but he was there during that period. And that was a time when I was in college. So I was not in Nigeria, although I visited 3 times.
You said that Nolting and your dad never spoke again.
Yes, I'm sorry to have left that out. That's a key point. After they had it out in the summer of '63, when Nolting returned, they never spoke again, and the families neither. So this was always and my mother told me about that in September of '63, that Fritz had actually come, being my godfather and being the kind of guy he was, had come by the house to say goodbye, I think the night before they left, to say goodbye really to me and my brother, also his godson, but who was 3. And so I didn't know anything of any of this terrible breach between them until September. My mother told me what had happened, and I was, of course, stunned and forever fascinated by how that could have happened. Over essentially a work problem, something that happened at the office, and now we're not friends with the Noltings anymore.
But did you speak to his children after the event?
Well,
for your
we
book?
had I think by the spring of '64, everybody's back in Washington, and Fritz resigns from the Foreign Service and goes to work for Morgan Guarantee Bank in Paris initially and in New York. But before the Noltings leave, well, when I went back and interviewed Mrs. Nolting, my godmother, she at first claimed that there was nothing to this. And I said, really? Did you, when you got back to Washington, did you see my parents? Sure. As 2 couples together? Well, no, maybe just Phoebe, my mother. Oh yeah, she said, I remember you came over to our house when we were about to leave. And so I think this is Phoebe going to say goodbye. Because the wives, they'd been close friends. They used to paint together in the French countryside. I mean, I wasn't particularly close to the kids because they were all older, but the youngest and I were friends. And Biddy remembered something about that visit. And a few other things she remembered, but not encounters. No, I think that I understood that Fritz and Bill ran into each other at a men's club in Washington, literally, unexpectedly, and asked after each other's children and moved on. So this was a big deal in the family, and I communicated when I graduated from high school. I sent the Noltings an invitation to my graduation ceremony, and I also sent one to Henry Cabot Lodge, and got really nice responses from both men. But the families never saw each other again until in 2017. I came down to do work on this book and I started in the archives at UVA because Nolting put all his papers there. My father had no papers and didn't. No, Nolting spent the rest of his life still worrying this bone, still fighting, still trying to correct the record, trying to justify his own behavior, wrote a book about it, um, gave a lot of interviews. My father less so, much less so. Of course, he wasn't as important, but he also wasn't. I think he moved on, at least professionally. He never spoke to me about this breach between the old friends. It was a topic that we just didn't, it just never came up in the family. As I say in the prologue to the book, it's, you know, if there's a family that has somebody who committed suicide or went to jail or something like that, it's one of those topics that everybody kind of maneuvers around without talking about it. This was that thing in my family. And so the opening anecdote of the book that kind of gets us going on what was this all about was, so fast forward to 1989, I'm living in Washington, I'm working for the Washington Post, I've just had my first child, and I see in the paper one morning that Fritz has died. And so I go over to see my parents, who lived 10 blocks away in Washington. And I said, "Oh, you saw that Fritz died?" "Yes." "I think I'll go down to the memorial service in Charlottesville next week to represent the family." And my father said, "Not if you care what I think, you won't." And that was the only conversation we ever had about it. And I didn't go, out of filial respect. But of course, it made me wonder ever after, this is 25 years after the fact. And I think I think my father didn't want my presence to suggest that he had let bygones be bygones or something like that. I failed to mention before that I think I've already explained why Nolting might be furious at Bill in his mind for not keeping him in touch or whatever. But he also wrote after he left Saigon, Nolting wrote one of these performance reviews of my father, in which he accused him of disloyalty. And in those, and of course that was disloyalty to Fritz, not disloyalty to
The U.S.
the
government.
U.S. government. But loyalty was such a big word for their generation because of what happened under McCarthy. People had to take loyalty oaths, and loyalty meant loyalty to the United States. And Bill took this very badly and thought he had been, well, I mean, he was furious about this, and I can only imagine. You can tell that it was a big deal that Nolting had written this, and I've seen that report because that's the one thing my father saved. But Bill's superiors in Washington and Nolting's superiors immediately wrote these letters defending my father and saying things like, we didn't tell Nolting because we didn't think he had anything to add. We would never have sent him back. In other words, a lot of people came around to support my father or to try to balance out what's going to be in his file. Did it hurt my father's career? Some people think so. I mean, some people think he might have become an ambassador sooner, but I don't know. I mean, I think it was very special circumstances, and And my father was not, Fritz left the Foreign Service when he was 53, so pretty young. And my father eventually became an ambassador and retired from the Foreign Service when he was yeah, well, 56. Is that right? Yeah, 56. Um, so, so they didn't have long careers in the Foreign Service for whatever reasons. I may have lost a train of thought there, but
It's okay. Well, why don't we talk about your college career? Because, it's kind of crazy that you start at the very start, I mean, not the very start, but, very early in the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And then what year do you graduate? Okay, well, where do you graduate from high school?
so I came back to Washington in 64, finished seventh grade and eighth grade in Washington. And then I went away to Exeter, to Phillips Exeter Academy for 4 years. This was something, my father had graduated very young from high school in Chester, and his mother sent him to Exeter for a kind of postgraduate year, and he loved it. And for as long as I can remember, he really wanted me to go there, and thought that it might also be helpful if he had to go overseas again. So I went to Exeter for ninth grade through 12th grade, and then went to college. I actually went first for one semester to Johns Hopkins and transferred in January to Amherst College, where I graduated in 1973. And it was during the first part of my college years that my family was in Nigeria.
Now, when you got back to the States, did you have any impressions about how the American public viewed the war and how you viewed the war as being on the ground? I know you're in middle school, but you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
how is that evolution, having that experience in Vietnam and then being in the US for,
Well, it's a little embarrassing to say this because, I, in the fullness of my youth, became an anti-war person and believed that we should get out as soon as we could, and that this was a war that was going nowhere, and people of my generation were dying. But initially, it shows how little of my father's skepticism about the enterprise rubbed off on me, or how little I understood about it, or maybe how little he talked about it. But I can remember my first year at Exeter, so that's 1965, 66. And I only really remember this because there's a newspaper photograph of it. There was a demonstration in the town of Exeter, New Hampshire, a peace demonstration. So in 1965, 66, this is like way before any of the significant demonstrations that you come to associate. But this was, so these were early adopters demonstrating, and a bunch of us snot-nosed Exeter kids went down and watched them and kind of sneered at them. And I just can't fathom how I could have been doing that, especially since I knew something about it. And maybe I sort of thought, well, my dad's in the government. The government's pursuing this policy. What do these people know? Uh, uh, what's all this about, protesting against our own government? I don't know what I was, for all my sophistication of being, living overseas and all that, I was incredibly close-minded and naive. And I only remember this because there's this photograph that was in the, it was unusual enough that a photograph of that demo was in the Boston Herald American, which was the tabloid newspaper there. And among the pictures of me and my other Exeter students in our jackets and ties, kind of standing on the edge of these solemn peace marchers. And during my high school years, so up until '69, I would say that the big issue on campus was much more about civil rights. And Black Power came to the fore during that issue, during that period. Assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., the riots in Detroit and Washington, D.C. And there was a similar kind of earthquake that happened at Exeter where there were black students just beginning to be black students, but a lot of attention to this and a lot of consciousness raising going on. It's interesting that Vietnam seemed to have been somewhat on the edges, but I think it's that at Exeter we had, since there were black students at Exeter and actually black faculty, I'm very proud of Exeter that was the case then. So this issue was kind of in our midst. It couldn't help but be in our midst. And whereas because we were privileged kids, nobody was going to Vietnam. So, to this day, I never knew a contemporary who served in Vietnam in the military, let alone died. Whereas my wife, who went to a regular high school in Ohio, guys were heading off to Vietnam and dying. And that was true for most Americans. But in this little enclave, everybody had a student deferment. It wasn't because of wealth. It was just student deferment. Everybody was headed to college. When I went to college, both starting at Hopkins and then at Amherst, that's when I became much more tuned into Vietnam as an issue, and by then somehow knew my mind about what was right and what was wrong. I think I must have learned some things from my father, and I remember my mother telling me in this period that one of the reasons my father wanted nothing more to do with Vietnam in his diplomatic career, and that he became such an opponent of the war, was that he was worried that I would be drafted and have to go. So it was personal, not just for him, but for the dads of so many people.
So he didn't, when you got involved in anti-war activities at your college, you weren't concerned that your father would be
No.
embarrassed or
No, I
uncomfortable?
think I knew that he sympathized, but he was still working for the government. And by then, he was an ambassador appointed by Nixon. He was a Foreign Service officer, but whoever's president does the appointing. And I have to credit him for not, he certainly didn't argue with me. The only incident I can remember which infuriated him it was actually more of a personal thing. Um, One of his colleagues and friends in the Foreign Service was a man named Graham Martin, who had become ambassador to Vietnam by that point. And Martin's son was killed in Vietnam. And I wrote my father up. It must have been a very snotty letter in which I probably said something like, maybe Graham Martin should think twice about the work he's doing if the cost has been the death of his son, like that. Just kind of an arrogant interpretation of events. And according to my mother, this really infuriated him. He didn't say anything to me about it, but because I think he was probably struggling himself about what was the right thing to do, even though he wasn't involved in that anymore. But the other incident, the other thing that didn't happen was that during the summer of 1970, I was in Lagos, Nigeria for about a month. And I was asked to speak about what was going on U.S. campuses. This is right after Kent State, and the 4 students were shot. My college in the spring of 1970 had gone on strike, and the college was shut down in solidarity with the students at Kent State, and Vietnam was a very big deal. And so everyone wanted to know what was going on American campuses. So I was invited to speak to a largely Nigerian audience about whatever I wanted to say about this. And I remember struggling a little bit about what I was going to say, but what I wanted to say, or what I was hoping to say, was that there were times like this when it was permissible to break the law, to be heard, or to fight against a greater evil. And I can't help thinking in retrospect, in fact, even then I couldn't help thinking that this was something that was really going over the line. If you were, well, from my father's point of view, he never said anything to me about it. There was somebody from the embassy, someone working for him, who was in the audience. So I'm sure he got a report on what I'd said. Whether it was an honest report or not, I don't know. There was no fallout from any of that. But I remember feeling a little bit facing a dilemma of my own of wanting to be honest. Well, first of all, trying to say what I thought, which is hard, but also trying to be honest, and also not wanting to hurt my father, but also wanting to, also in competition with my father, a classic thing. But anyway, so yeah.
You also mentioned that you guys went to an Air Force base? You were bused to
Yeah.
an Air Force base?
So later at Amherst, I became the editor of the school paper, and because one of the other consequences of this whole time on American campuses was that corrupt old institutions like student councils were flushed down the toilet, and student government, that's for losers. We got much more important stuff on our minds. Justice, racial justice in America, ending the war. We were going to do it all. Um, but because there was no student council, there were no student leaders, but because I was the editor of the paper, I kind of became that person. And I was the person that the president of the college wanted to treat with, I became very close to the president, he was a new president, and he had come from the faculty. He was a very charismatic guy.
Do you remember his name?
John William Ward. And in 71, there were more demonstrations. I did go to Washington a couple of times, covered them for the paper, and certainly as a student journalist, I wasn't too worried about keeping my objectivity covering something like that, which of course, as a journalist, you would never participate in the march and cover it. So in the spring of 1972, when I was editor of the paper, the Nixon administration announced that it was blockading the harbor at Haiphong to prevent the resupply of Vietnamese forces. But it was also going to have, they were also bombing North Vietnam in those days, and it was going to have terrible repercussions on the Vietnamese people. So this was the latest big campus everywhere, campus cause. And John William Ward, the president, came before the school, the college, and said, "This is an outrage. I could write letters to the editor, I could make speeches, but this is not the time for that. This is the time for action." Kind of like me in my speech back in Lagos, and he says, "So accordingly, tomorrow morning, I'm going to go to the gates of Westover Air Force Base and sit down and be arrested for civil disobedience." And as he did, and there were dozens of faculty members with him and hundreds of students. In all honesty, I was not among the students because I slept through the bus. But there were makeup demonstrations at the Air Force Base a few days later, where I did do that. But John William Ward getting arrested made the newspapers and pissed off alumni in a major way. I'm not sure he ever recovered, Ward, from, he resigned in about 77, but I think he had really poisoned the well for our, all male, very conservative alumni group. But I think he was a great man, a troubled man, who took his own life eventually. But I remember being active. First time I can remember making a lot of speeches and trying to, as often as a moderator when people are debating civil disobedience, for example, and acts of conscience, things like that. So that affected my, and I wrote a lot of editorials, and it was a very formative time in my life, and pointed me in the direction of journalism eventually. I mean, not eventually, I went to work for a newspaper immediately after college.
Did you ever, in these protests, did you ever talk about your experience in Vietnam as part of that?
You know, I didn't. I felt a little like, I think there was kind of a disconnect, actually. I, I, I don't think I ever would have talked about it because it would have implied that I knew something, that I had a special understanding of Vietnam, and I don't, and then, neither then nor now do I think that. I think my understanding was of being a privileged white boy who happened to grow up partly there. And I thought that was the kind of the opposite of authentic. Um, so I think that's probably why I didn't. I thought it would. I didn't think it would help my case, whatever I was trying to say. And I don't know. I can't. Maybe I also didn't want to, in that day, implicate my father in the war, a war he opposed. But I think it was too complicated. I think I was probably much more in tune with what my peers thought, and what was the correct point of view, that kind of thing.
Did you ever go back to Vietnam?
I went with my son in 2016, and I had a section of it in my book that was removed. The last section of my book was much longer, with lots more about me in Vietnam, the various ways that Vietnam intersected with my life. But I think my editor and others who read the book thought that once we leave Vietnam, then it's all on you, Charlie. And some of it's interesting and related, but we've gone into reading this book to read about Vietnam in the early 60s and Fritz and Bill. And I think, you're stretching it out longer than you should. I think that's correct. But I was sorry because it's been fun to have my son and me going to look at. We went back at the intersection. Have anybody been to Saigon? No. At the intersection, what's now this incredible Asian city with skyscrapers. I mean, it bears no relation to the place. The kind of lazy French colonial city that I knew. But at the intersection where the first monk self-immolated is a little park, shrine to that guy. And the famous photograph that was taken by Malcolm Brown, an American reporter, of the guy burning himself, has been colorized and made into this huge poster, public, like a mural almost, with gardens and religious iconography. So we went and visited that place and in that shrine, and we had a Vietnamese guide who was a guy about my age. So, in other words, somebody who who remembered the old days. And I said, so this is still a thing, for Vietnamese people, do people still remember those days, and how do they make that fit with what's happened in Vietnam now, which is, of course, it became a communist country, but is now a robustly capitalist, still government. It's still not a free country, but it's obviously a very robust economic power. And he said that yes, they want to honor this monk and that movement because that was the way they got rid of the oppressive Ziem regime and the colonial piece, but also eventually that was the way they got rid of the Americans. So he was a hero, a martyr in that sense. But he said the government doesn't want to make too much of it because they don't want to remind people that they have the power to overthrow the government. Mm-hmm. In other words, that we don't want this good idea to spread too far. We want to honor it for back then, but we don't want to put ideas into people's heads. And I thought that was a really very interesting observation about those days and these days that I'm sorry is not in the book, but
maybe it's another project.
I don't think so.
Well, and so you worked for newspapers after you graduated.
I worked for 5 years for the Greensboro Daily News in North Carolina, writing editorials and book reviews. I worked for 3 years at the Baltimore News American, a paper that doesn't exist. Well, really, the Greensboro paper doesn't either. The Baltimore News American as editorial page editor and also book reviews. And then freelanced for a couple of years. I moved to California and freelanced for Publishers Weekly, which is, you know what that is, a trade magazine. And when USA Today started, I became their magazine columnist, that is, writing about magazines. And then I got out of journalism entirely for 3 years and went to work at Harvard as the number 2 at the Institute of Politics, which is a part of the Kennedy School, but predates the Kennedy School. And then in 1986, joined the Washington Post to cover first books and magazines. I wrote a magazine column and covered the publishing world, and I did lots of author interviews. That was really the main reason they hired me, was to do long profiles of authors. And then there I met my wife, who was a business reporter at the Post, and we were married and then applied to join the foreign staff, which the Post was encouraging couples on the staff to apply for foreign staff work because they could get 2 reporters but only have expenses for 1. And because in those days they, would give you a house and a car and tuition when you went overseas. So it was really a good deal. And we had tiny children, so we were first in Canada for 3 years, living in Toronto, but covering the whole country. And then, because we both spoke French, we were sent to Paris in 1996. And did that job, both of us, for 4 years. And then they said it's time to come back to Washington, and we quit. I mean, not angrily, but we wanted to stay in Paris and raise our kids there. And my wife, what really made it possible was my wife was hired right away by Bloomberg News in Paris as an editor. And so I was then free to write, spend a few years writing a novel that I didn't succeed in getting published, not about Vietnam. And then I became director of the American Library in Paris, which is a 100-year-old institution that now is thriving and a big kind of cultural and community hub, not just for Americans, but for English speakers and anybody interested in Franco-American things. And I retired from that in 2017 and immediately went to work on this book. I mean, I've always known I wanted to write the story. And there's an anecdote in the book involving David Halberstam, who you've certainly heard of, who was one of those reporters in Saigon at the time. An anecdote where he comes to Greensboro, where I'm living, and I had a hand in his getting an invitation and arranging his visit. And we're backstage waiting for him to go on for this talk. And we were having a cigarette, and it was in the dark because it was kind of in the wings. And he started talking about Fritz and Bill and what had happened because he had seen it up close. And he said, this would make a wonderful novel. And here's how you could do it. And he started scribbling stuff on an envelope. And I was thinking, aren't you nervous about, going to make a talk? And, but he obviously put an idea into my head. And there have been times in my life when I thought about doing it as a novel, but I just thought the real material is much better, even though it would be nice to have a scene where they're shouting at each other and throwing accusations at each other. You could easily dramatize this, as I hope somebody will. But I couldn't do that. And the historical record is, I think, pretty amazing. There's a lot of stuff there that's available to anyone. It's not just to me.
I did love your use of archival resources.
Oh, thank you.
And, your mother's letters and,
Oh, well, the letters. Oh my God. My father wrote his mother. He went away to Exeter in 1934 at age 16, 15, really. And wrote his mother 2-3 times a week until she died.
and she kept it all.
40 years later. And she kept it all in order in a Thalheimer's dress box.
Oh,
It may have been Miller and Rhodes, but I remember both those department stores from visiting my grandmother here. Unfortunately, he never wrote his mother about all the cool stuff I was interested in. My mother did that. She saved her letters and my letters as well in the same box. So that's one piece of the archive. But Nolting saved every piece of paper. And, his family, apparently, I saw from going through the UVA archives that that they would say, document missing at the request, at the request of the family. I'm thinking, oh, wow, that's probably something I wish I could have
the
seen.
meaty stuff.
But there's plenty of meaty stuff in there, except for what, the real need of that you'd have if you, I don't know, if you had some record of their confrontations or their how that all came down. I don't know. so one has to kind of imagine it.
Okay, I have two questions. What, was your dad considered some sort of um, an exceptional student? Is that why he graduated so early from school?
I guess so. I mean, he was a very smart man, and he was, it's Chester, Virginia. Uh, so he graduated when he was in 1934. So in June of 34, he would have not, he would have been 15, and went straight off to Exeter after that. A place that his mother just read about in the magazine. She just heard it was a good place, and wrote away and enrolled him. And as I say in the book, in those days, Exeter was full of rich kids from New England and New York, and taking someone like my father was their idea of diversity, because he was from small town Virginia. But he says it changed his life, and Exeter really changed my life, because I learned to write there, and I feel I learned so much more in high school than I did in college. I felt like I knew it all when I got to college. Classic problem. But yeah, so he was very young and very serious young man.
Isn't he started at Yale and then he went down to UVA?
He started at Yale, and and his letters to his mother are, sound like a guy who's just having a ball, and very active time. And he transferred to UVA for his junior and senior years. He told me, it was never clear to me why, because I would have thought, well, if you're at Yale, why would you go to UVA? But I think in those days, at Yale, he was surrounded by so much money that he couldn't keep up. The only evidence out of that is that his father refused to buy it, that his parents were divorced, long divorced, and but his father wouldn't spring for a tuxedo, which seemingly you needed to have at Yale. Incredible, really. But his parents were not wealthy. I mean, my grandfather was the president of the bank, but he was not a wealthy man, for sure. It might interest you all to know this, that there's a chapter in the book called Two Gentlemen of Virginia, which is about these two guys, their background, how they came to, what their families were all about. And I was able to do, unlike the kinds of archives and government records I was looking at for the rest of the book, here I had to do different kind of research. And one place that was incredibly helpful, and what a resource, was the Library of Virginia, right here in Richmond. And I just got so much help, so much attention and help for the weird little things I was looking for. But I also went to Chester, and unfortunately the Chester Library had every yearbook except that one. Mm-hmm. That was the missing yearbook, where I might have learned a little more to answer your question about, why was he was the valedictorian, but that much I knew. But I also went to, my grandfather was a banker, as I said, which is why he never used his middle name, which was Cheatham. But anyway, he built the this little bank building, which I remembered from photographs of seeing it, and drove to Chester, and there it was. I mean, it was an unmistakable, very humble little corner building, which is now a barber shop. And I went in, and barbers are standing around, and customers in there, and I said, well, okay, I'll get a haircut, and I told them about my grandfather, and they said, oh yeah, and there's the vault. We keep the mops and brooms in the vault of this little tiny bank building. It was kind of cool.
Yeah. Nice when things stand, you know.
And find a new use.
Yeah. Okay, so 1975. How do you and your father and your mother, your whole family, how do you react to the fall of Saigon?
I mean, I don't recall that we did. I don't recall discussing it. I'm sure we did. But I have I was not living at home at that time, and was certainly writing editorials about all that, which I don't remember particularly. But no, we didn't, it seems strange to say, we didn't talk much about Vietnam. My father and I, or maybe it's because nobody wanted to get close to talking about Fritz. I don't know.
Yeah.
I just don't know.
I mean, did you guys discuss Nigeria more?
No.
And you're like more
Not particularly. Not particularly. In the 70s and 80s, I mean, my father was a very strong Democrat and couldn't stand Nixon, couldn't stand Reagan, and thought a lot of American foreign policy was misguided in that whole period. In retirement, he could feel free to say that, but he wasn't a polemicist, and he had strong opinions, but he kept a lot of those opinions to himself, I guess you'd say. There's a retired Foreign Service club called DACOR in Washington, and he was the president of that, so he still hung out with his old pals. He actually went into the residential real estate business. There was a kind of boutique realty company in Washington that had been founded by other Foreign Service officers in their retirements, and he became a partner in that, and sold houses, and not terribly happily, but I think he was probably making more money than he had as a civil servant. My mother thought it was a terrible come down and humiliation. Things were not really very good in their marriage in those retirement years. Because of that, I don't know, not just that, but I think my mother, coming home from the Foreign Service, and especially having been an ambassador's wife, and suddenly having to fend for herself and having no status in the community, and I think she took his retirement much harder than he did, because it had become her life, and she was really good at it, and now she was just another empty nester in Washington. And
did she ever get back into drawing or anything?
she did do some painting. She was a painter all those years in France and Britain and Saigon. She painted oils, and I still have a number of her paintings. She was quite good. She did some painting then. She was also determined to be bipolar, and in her kind of crazy, some of her crazy phases in, say, the 80s, she did some really odd paintings. Not ones that I really want to say, maybe because I don't have good memories of that. Although she did one that I still have in Paris that's quite lovely. She did mainly still lives and still lifes, I should say, and buildings. She didn't do portraits.
Oh,
Anyway, and my father died in 1992, just a few weeks before we left for Canada. And so he was young. He was 74, and my mother lived another 15 years. Quite happily, actually.
there has to be some status to be had for being a former ambassador's wife.
I guess. I think she alienated a lot of her friends, so she didn't have a chance to. She didn't really want to see people, and so she wouldn't have had a chance to share old stories. They did some of that, being a little harsh on them, but I was living in Washington with them, so I was much more. The first time in my adult life, I was back living where they were living, and so I had to experience that in ways I wouldn't necessarily have if I had been in the Foreign Service. And I'm very sad that my father loved France and he loved to cook. He was a very good cook, and but he never knew that I went to live in France,
That's
where
great.
I've now lived for almost 30 years. He would have loved that, and but
Well, I mean, you're keeping the tradition alive.
and he probably wouldn't have loved this book. I mean,
Okay.
he just the idea that I'd be probing into this difficult time in his life, and of course that I didn't understand even today. Didn't understand any of it really. I'm trying to piece together these shards of memory and the historical record. But he always, my mother was always saying, you should be writing this down. You should write something about it. And he said, no, not going to do that. But there are people like that. One of the people I interviewed for this book, one of the few people who were adults back then who are still alive, had an incredibly important life. His name is Anthony Lake. I don't know if it means anything to you, but he was in his first Foreign Service posting, age 23, in Saigon back then, and went on to be the National Security Advisor to Clinton, and ran UNICEF for 10 years and had a very interesting career. Never written his memoirs. Said, he sees it every memoir I read, they're lying. How could I write a memoir? Interesting attitude, but you got a good portrait of him. There was another young Foreign Service officer in Saigon at the time, Richard Holbrooke, who went on to become an even more famous American diplomat who died young. And he and Lake were close in Saigon, but also Holbrooke was sleeping with Lake's wife, which they all knew and came to live with. But there's a very interesting portrait of Tony Lake in this biography of Holbrooke called Our Man by George Packard of the New Yorker. or just George Packer, who writes for the New Yorker and for the Atlantic. But he obviously spent a lot of time with Tony Lake and talked about their rivalry, Holbrook and Lake, that persisted for years. They're always kind of like watching each other and criticizing each other, but respecting each other. Really interesting pairing. I might have, if I'd been doing that book, I might have made it about the two of them instead of just one of them. But there's lots of insights in there.
I just have a question about, you think about ambassadorships now and how they're awarded to the donors and the presidents make them very political.
Yeah.
So like your dad was appointed by Nixon to Nigeria, and you say that he was not a supporter of Nixon.
No.
And so, I mean, do you think that that's just a kind of commentary about how our foreign service has really suffered under the, under
Well, even
subsequent
then,
presidents?
even back then, political appointees, that's to say, not foreign service officers, were common. But any country that's important or unattractive still gets foreign service people, because they either need the expertise or they can't sell some of these lesser posts to a donor. Now, it kind of depends on I follow this very closely because, of course, political appointees were bad news in my household. But when my father was ambassador to Nigeria, it was the biggest embassy in Africa, but there weren't political appointees in Africa. They got, political appointees in Morocco and Tunisia, because those are attractive places to live, I guess, but otherwise not. So I think actually the number's gone up and down, but I don't think it's appreciably worse now than it was, or out of balance, put it that way, than it was then. But I don't think, I also don't think it matters as much now, because anything of, and it's too bad for foreign service officers too, because anything of importance, anything that has the attention of the White House in terms of trouble, someone in Washington is going to just come right over or pick up the telephone and talk to the head of state. And so diplomats in place are basically cut out of the action. They're only there to kind of keep regular relations and file reports on what's going on in the country, but they have much less discretion, because they can get instructions in real time for what to do and what to say. Whereas back then, a lot of these telegrams that I read, the State Department saying to Nolting or Trueheart, we think you should cover these points when you next see Ziem, but only you can decide, because you're the man on the ground. And basically we've got your back, whatever it is you decide to do. That's why we sent you there, because you're the expert, not us. Now, even then they still probably thought they knew better, but now, gosh, I can remember, so this is, still a long time ago, but in the late 90s, I covered, while based in Paris, both Anne, my wife, and I were sent to the Balkans and to Kosovo to cover parts of that war. And it was very frustrating. You think you're the reporter on the ground, but your editors back in Washington are watching CNN, and they're also talking to the White House, which has its own ties. And so, you send in what you think you've seen, and it suddenly becomes a smaller piece of some bigger report that involves other people or what they're saying on TV or what happened between the time you filed your story and the time we're going to press. Of course, now there is no such thing as going to press. It's like we're a 24-hour newsroom at the Washington Post or the New York Times. So same analogous kind of lack of discretion and lack of power that you have in the field. And I feel like Anna and we were kind of on the last generation that had all those cool perks. And, when we first started doing that, we would send a note to Washington that says, here's what we're going to do today. Here's what we're going to turn in a few hours based on what we think the story is. And by the time we left, it was like, no, here's what you're going to do today.
Mm-hmm.
Here's what we just seen this on TV, so we think you ought to do this. And that's not as much fun.
What's your wife's full name?
Anne, A-N-N-E, Swardson, S-W-A-R-D-S-O-N.
Well,
Cornell, 75.
Cornell. Is there any questions you wish I had asked you about your Vietnam or your anti-war activities that I haven't asked you today?
Well, certainly not my anti-war activities, which, I really have to, I was not on the front lines. I was fairly typical and lucky in a lot of ways. And as I said before, I'm not sure I bolstered or even informed my anti-war views and activities on the basis of having lived there. It's not exactly a disconnect, but I'm just not sure I really learned anything. When people said Saigon, I know what that feels like. I still do, but I think at my age, I'm not sure I was absorbing the kinds of things that might have informed that. So no, not about that. I don't know, but why don't we take a little break, and if I think of something,
Yeah, we can.
I'll come back and do that.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good. Would you like me to show you the restroom?
I think I know.
So we're returning after a break. If you, through all of your own personal experience, going through the war, and through writing this book, do you have a feeling of what the greatest misconception of the Vietnam War is? It's a really big question.
It really is. You mean a misconception today about it, or a misconception at the time? What are you thinking of?
I'm thinking either one. Whichever one you got something to give us.
Well, I think it was a mistake. This is hardly original with me. I think it was a mistake to regard Vietnam as this place where the great forces of communism and democracy were duking it out. That Vietnam is a country that had been invaded for centuries, and occupied for centuries by alien cultures, and had just thrown off the French. And the idea that the idea that we would be seen any differently was a fantasy, and I think it took Americans a long time to understand that this was a movement, a nationalist movement that had precious little to do with communism as we understood it or the American way of life, but simply Vietnamese people wanting to take charge of their own destiny, which seems to be a fairly common human desire. And it seems to me that one of the legacies of Vietnam, and it cuts both ways, one of the legacies of America's Vietnam experience, and it cuts both ways, is that we can't play our games on in these fields, and we have to remind ourselves always whose lives are really at stake in these battles that we're waging. For people making policy in the United States, Vietnam has been this great, for 50 years, has been this this warning about getting too involved, about nation building, about imposing our values on others. And we keep learning the lesson in new ways over and over again. From time to time, I'm thinking especially of during the second Bush administration, when George W. Bush was planning to go into war in Iraq, there was a large number of people who had been anti-Vietnam War people who said, but this time we can do it differently. This time the causes are more just. The two situations have nothing to do with each other. We know better, and they found out that they didn't. And I think it's a hard lesson for the United States of America to learn, and yet we keep needing to learn it over and over again. And I can't, the issue that's with us today as we record these words in Israel and Gaza, I'm not sure where Vietnam fits into that, except that it's very alarming, and I think we're right to be concerned that their struggle could spread, struggle that Israel is waging and that the Palestinians are waging could spread and become something much graver. But I brought that up because if there's a Vietnam lesson to be learned in this current crisis, I don't see what it is yet. But I do think that we hear echoes of Vietnam in U.S. support for Ukraine. Obviously a much closer entity, a much closer country to traditional Western interests than Vietnam was. But here's a case where we want you to fight the war against the Russians. We're on your side, but we're not going to send in our men and women to fight the war for you. But that moment may come, and then you'll hear a lot more about Vietnam, I think. But I actually kind of lament that. I'm glad that you're doing this exhibit, because I think Vietnam is receding in the memory of people, especially younger people. And it's important to remember what it was about and was not about.